whether they pay their bill, and what would be a minor complaint becomes a major complaint. Again, just another reason why we're in a lot better shape if we can anticipate the issues. I have a hunch, based on some studies we've done, that about 90% of the issues that organizations get involved in are really self-created. I mean, we simply shot ourselves in the foot. I want to just emphasize that point only because the responsibility for seeing that that doesn't happen starts with the people who are out there talking to the constituencies. A lot of times I'm dealing with clients and the public relations department says, well, it wasn't our fault, you know, the management wouldn't do this. I say, That's your fault, because you're supposed to be the communicators, the persuaders, the understanders, and if you couldn't persuade your own management, don't blame them. That's you that didn't do it. Now, I don't want to put a heavy trip on you or anything like that. But the fact is, you are going to have the first-hand experience of what they're really feeling and saying out there about issues around the company. And you then have the responsibility to make sure they hear you. Let's talk about some of the kinds of things that are happening in people's heads when they start sensing issues around a company. The first thing that I think you have to look for is what the sociologists call a sense of abuse. Now, the sociologists have a principle which says that any change in the relationship between an organization and its publics is the result of an abuse on the part of one. For example, the company may do things to the payphones because teenagers have been tearing them off the wall or whatever, and the company felt that abuse, and so we will enact a policy to try and deal with that. Or customers won't like the billing system, and so they will take the cards that say, do not fold, mutilate, or bend, and they will fold, mutilate, and bend. You know what I mean. This arises from a sense of abuse, of a change that has occurred. Now, if you're out there looking for issues, I think we have to be very sensitive, again, to what these changes were and why do people feel abused by this. The reason this is terribly important is that the psychologists also tell us you cannot communicate with a person who feels that you have abused them. I mean, just go home tonight and talk to your spouse, and you'll know exactly what I mean. If there's that feeling of abuse, you know how hard it is to get talking again and get it all worked out. And until you put that behind you, the way is literally blocked to communicate. So when we're anticipating issues, we need, when we hear negatives, and we hear them pretty strongly and emotionally, and it sounds like they might qualify as issues, we need to say, well, what's the abuse behind this? Tricky part. Oftentimes, the issue that they're bringing to your attention has nothing to do with the abuse. It's only the emotion of abuse coming out in the handiest possible way. When we hear that, we need to do two things. We need to look for the abuse, and then we need to get underneath that abuse and say, okay, what's really going on here? Interestingly enough, the only mechanism that the company has for doing that is the face-to-faces. Now, there are a couple of positive things you can look for, too. You might look, first of all, for people who desire some participation in an issue that they may have raised. Participation is, of course, the great battle cry of the new American Revolution. It's what people want to do. They want to be involved. So always look for participation, even among those who complain. How can we get them involved in this? How can we let them help solve the problem? That's something you're going to run into. It's a technique that you need to know about in anticipating issues. Because the alternative, if we don't let them get involved, is that their interest in that issue is bound to increase. Sometimes we postulate that a person will start an issue. You know, you don't hear about it, and all of a sudden there's Susie Smith over in Casper, and she's kind of an activist and complainer anyway, and she brings up this issue, so everybody says, oh, that doggone Susie, you know, she's at it again, she's raised this issue. That is a mistake that none of us involved in issues must ever make, because the chances that Susie really started that issue are almost nil. Case in point, When Ralph Nader stood up and said, you know, I think Detroit could make cars that were safer, didn't need so many repairs, got better mileage, did all of us suddenly say, gosh, Ralph, I never thought of that. What a great idea. That's not what we said, is it? We said, right on, Ralphie, baby. We've been trying to tell our local dealer that for 20 years. So what Nader did was merely to surface that issue and became its spokesperson, the leading edge of the issue. And so we need to look behind the spokesperson for an issue and not make the mistake of just damning that person and say, oh, there goes Susie again, raising another issue. But we need to be able to look behind that and find out, where did Susie get the idea? How widespread is it out there? This, again, is where constituency management programs have just unparalleled capabilities. Because we're now sitting one-on-one with Susie. And we can say, gosh, Suze, tell me about it. And sooner or later, Susie will probably say, well, you know, my cousin, and gee, the guy down the street. And pretty soon we start finding out, that Susie is indeed a spokesperson for this issue and not the originator of the issue. The difference between those two is critical. Finally, let me just say that in looking for issues, despite all these somewhat technical guides that I've tried to give you for determining what an issue is, I think we also have to sometimes turn a little bit of a deaf ear. That may sound contradictory, but you know, a lot of people, when you go to them to meet with them as constituency managers, are going to automatically be prompted to think of all the negatives they can to tell you, because that's why you're there. That's one of the dangers of any kind of research with people, is that they start dredging up in their minds all the things that they could say. So I think we need to be very careful how we hear these issues expressed. And of course, that's the reason we need to chart all of the input from all of the constituency managers, not only in the state, but across the company, so that we can start seeing whether this is a recurring subject or whether this is just one thing that we've picked up. Now, I think we have to probably make a note, faithfully and honestly, of all the things that we're told by any of the constituency opinion leaders that we meet with. I think we have to write that down. But I think part of our job is also to be sensitive to when they really mean it, when this is really their issue, and when they're just trying to give us a laundry list because they kind of feel that's their responsibility, you know, as the leaders of a constituency that are being honored, and it is an honor in a sense, by the company by being noticed as a constituency leader. There are essentially three responses to issues, and maybe I'll just close this portion by covering those. As I said, this is a subject that we do indeed give week-long seminars on, and I wanted to cut it down to those specific things that may be most useful to you immediately. The first is what we call dousing the fire, and that is to avoid the controversy, avoid the confrontation on the issue at all costs when it's a complex issue, a very difficult issue, doesn't work well in a confrontational situation. We've all seen that in politics. The candidate with a really good program, but which is a little complicated, tends to lose with the other to the other candidate with a neat, catchy slogan, which is simplistic, probably won't work, but that's the way it is. Sometimes also there are issues that simply will divert the organization from its primary goals of the moment. And in that case, we have to help douse the fire. These are things that constituency managers have to do to carry messages back to the constituency. Also, a lot of times, groups that may not be our allies need these issues to keep themselves alive. You know, how do activist groups and community groups keep themselves going? They've got to show that they're doing something for their constituents. And so one strategy is to douse the fire. Avoid confrontation at all costs. The second is to let the fire burn itself out. By that, essentially, we mean just leave the decision to the opponents, whether they're going to make a big issue out of it. Don't respond, don't reply, Don't do anything. When does this apply? Well, it's most useful when the threat of the organization striking back has real power over the folks who are raising an issue. And if you think about your company and its size and position in the region, you do have a lot of suasion in that sense. And certainly as a regulated industry, you never hesitated to use that power on legislators and others, but it's a perfectly legitimate power. Someone who is raising an issue with the company knows that you are big and have a lot of friends and followers, and sometimes when they're attacking us on issues, we need to just let them make the decision, let the issue burn itself out, because usually that's what will happen. Also, a lot of times the people who are raising unfair issues are weak and underfunded, and they will run out of steam. Also, it's nice if we're prepared in advance, and so we can have that luxury of just letting them start the fight if they want to, because once they start it and we have to join it, it's pretty sure that we're going to win it. Sometimes, and this is really the whole reason that I'm listing these three potential responses to issues, sometimes it makes sense to fan the flames, to actually seek confrontation, to take issues and help them get on the public agenda. For example, there are complicated, tricky issues that it's hard to get out before the public or to get them to care about. But sometimes we can find people who are concerned, who are willing to raise those issues, and we should actually encourage them to do so. Other times, there are things that are going on that we would just as soon divert attention from, and believe it or not, another issue may have that advantage as a strategic ploy. Sometimes we are also called to account on issues by people who really are so self-serving, whose true colors, if they're known, are going to put them in such a bad light that it makes a lot of sense to go ahead. Let the battle begin. If there's one rule to keep in mind when we're out there thinking about issues, identifying issues, it's that people who bring up issues are not the bad guys. I have clients who are always, I have one client in particular, a chief executive, who's always talking about the activists, and they're so terrible. Well, what we did was we simply made a list of all the things that this guy does, which are trying to change society and change the company and so forth. And we just brought him a list of that, and we put on the top of it, we said, definition of an activist. Because, you know, we're all activists too. And we need to remember that in our kind of a society, that every idea or message that we put into the court of public opinion is probably going to be questioned or countered by somebody else. And that's not, you know, bad behavior. That's the way it works, because after all, when people bring up ideas we don't like, we generally counter them too. So I guess the first rule for managing constituencies is to realize that some of them are not always going to be friendly, and that when they aren't friendly, they're probably more valuable to us than at any other time, because then they will tell us things with the full emotion that's in their hearts, and it will give us opportunities to sense how strongly they feel and really do something about it. What is an opinion leader? Well, first of all, an opinion leader has to have, as far as we're concerned, has to be part of a network. Now, we may call that a constituency, a group of stakeholders, a public, an audience. But obviously, to be a leader of something, you've got to have some people that you're going to lead. Now, that's very important, because a lot of the folks that you'll put on your opinion leader list, if you only go by who gets their name in the paper, or who's a loudmouth at the public hearings all the time, they don't have any following. So they're not opinion leaders. Be very careful of that. They've got to have a following. That's the first thing. The second thing about an opinion leader is that they've got to be credible within this network. They've got to have credibility. Well, that's an old overused word if there ever was one, but the psychologists tell us a lot about credibility. We know, for example,